Welcome to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire, a series that digs deep into the life and works of one of the greatest novelists of all time. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. That famous opening line from George Orwell's 1984 has an immediate, unsettling effect on the reader. We know that something has happened to time. Paris, October 1793. The ruling National Convention has ordered into law its new Republican calendar. As a citizen of France, trying to stay on top of all the dizzying changes of the last 4 years, you must now accept that you are living in the year 2. And whenever you read the time by an official clock, the numbers on the face now run up to 10 instead of 12. You now work a 10-day week. Each day is 10 hours long, each hour 100 minutes long. The days of your week have new names.
Primidi, Duodi,
So do the months of your year.
Cartidi, Brumaire, Frimaire, Nivose, Pluviose, Ventose, Germinal.
This is a clean break from all that has gone before. Catching your reflection in a glass, you make sure that you are wearing the latest revolutionary fashion. The cockade in your hat has changed a few times now. Green was the colour at first, but that was quickly discarded for being too royal. Then it was blue, the colour of the American revolutionaries who had overthrown British rule. Blue, which then combined with red from the old Paris coat of arms. Then, General Lafayette, the great hero of Yorktown, was said to have added a white stripe to the cockade to show loyalty to the king. Not George III, of course, but Louis XVI. So, as you stand adjusting your ill-fitting striped trousers and your red Phrygian cap, it occurs to you how shabby people look these days. Knee breeches and stockings are out, and only an idiot would dare to wear silk. So, you tug your cotton waistcoat into some kind of shape and ensure the slogan that you have had woven into it is clearly visible.
Liberté,
Liberty,
égalité,
equality,
fraternité,
fraternity,
ou la mort.
or death. Earlier this year, in Pluviose, the month of rain, you may have witnessed the execution of your hapless King Louis XVI, a figure who in the early stages of revolution had been popular with his people. He had donned the red cap of liberty. He had signed away his divine right and ushered in the new constitution. But this was not enough.
The king must die, so that the country can live.
God has also been abolished. The statues of saints and martyrs torn down, crucifixes destroyed, bells silenced. And inside the great cathedral of Notre Dame, the altar is now a shrine to reason and has the torch of truth burning in front of it. And if you feel any sympathy for the thousands who have been sent to the guillotine, you'd better not show it, because
Pity is treason.
Here to talk to us about the French Revolution is the fantastic historian Adam Zamoyski, whose celebrated works on the Napoleonic era occupy a sizable chunk of my bookshelf. Over my shoulder now I can see 1812, Napoleon's fatal march on Moscow, Rights of Peace, Phantom Terror, and Napoleon, the man behind the myth. Our discussion today takes its inspiration from Adam's book, Holy Madness, which puts the reader deep inside the hearts and minds of the people who lived through the age of revolution, examining what happens when Christianity is overthrown by Enlightenment thinking mixed with a very toxic form of nationalism. What Dickens describes as the period in his opening chapter of A Tale of Two Cities, from the year of our Lord 1775 through to the terror of the 1790s. Reading the thoughts and slogans from revolutionaries such as Robespierre and British conservatives such as Edmund Burke is the brilliant actress Lena Robin. I hope you enjoy the episode.
The second half of the 18th century, and certainly the last quarter, saw tremendous change, social change everywhere in how people looked at society. most of Europe followed France from a sort of Voltairean Enlightenment towards a Rousseauist, more radical one, and one based more on irrational feeling and so on. In Britain, it was a bit different. It was much more about questions of parliamentary reform and of a wish to simply improve and build on the Great Revolution of 1688. And remember that the first centenary was coming up in 1788. And throughout the 1780s in Britain, there was a strong movement and a body of opinion which felt that this would be the right moment to, well, improve on it and get rid of the rotten boroughs and so on. Prime Minister Pitt himself tried to do it in the early 1780s, but couldn't get it through Parliament or get enough support in the establishment. And then, of course, the movement for reform in Britain, which was entirely peaceful up till then and based very much on various corresponding societies and discussion groups up and down the country, was very excited by the first events taking place in France, the calling of the Estates General, the fall of the Bastille, and all really everything that happened until about 1792 had a strong resonance, and they felt that it was a spur to action in Britain. But of course, the more these people in their corresponding societies, the would-be parliamentary reformers, talked to France, the more the establishment closed ranks and began to associate them with French revolutionaries. And the French Revolution became less and less attractive as viewed from Britain as time went on. And by 1791, already 2 years after the fall of the Bastille, Edmund Burke and like that were just saying, no, this is the sort of road to perdition. This is frightful.
Their liberty is not liberal. Their science is presumptuous ignorance. Their humanity is savage and brutal.
But somehow British public opinion then very much switched to praising the so-called Polish Revolution of 1791, when fundamentally the nobility, led by the greatest magnates in the land, passed a new constitution, bringing in essentially a constitutional monarchy, which was universally praised in Britain, and was juxtaposed to the French as being, an example of what could be achieved without violence, and therefore what could be achieved in England. Just because you were going to have reform, it didn't have to be French-style reform with people losing their titles and people being tossed about and the king being imprisoned, and then all the horrors that started happening. And so there was originally what was happening in France seemed to be very much in tune with what most enlightened people in Britain felt. It then polarized a very nasty, where the lower orders in France became horribly revolutionary and bloodthirsty against the aristocracy and any member of the establishment. In Britain, the lower orders acted in exactly the opposite direction by becoming arch conservatives, and whatever they call the Church and King riots of the early 1790s were aimed at anybody who wasn't the Church of England, anybody who was a reformist of any stripe, and people like poor old Priestley had his laboratory destroyed, and some very, very unpleasant things were carried out. So there was then successive British ministries actually found very convenient because just like the French revolutionaries, that they could call on a huge body of public opinion to support them. That then changed when the war with France affected British manufacturing, and particularly the textile industry, and perfectly legitimate demands for better conditions were immediately conflated with bloodthirsty French Revolution and so on and so forth. So there was this polarization which was, well, largely manipulated by the powers that be. So there were many similarities between what was going on in Britain and France, but almost in inverted manner. There were many ironies there. It's a long time since I read A Tale of Two Cities, and I can't remember to what extent Dickens touches on these ironies.
Yes, I think he's quite damning towards both countries. I know that he read Thomas Carlyle's history avidly, and that inspired him to write it. And I suppose, I think really he's just struck by the inhumanity of it. He understands the cause, the grievance that people felt against the Ancien regime, but just the sheer horror. I mean, I just wonder, at what point does this mood for reform sicken into something so violent and uncontrollable and devours its own progenitors?
Well, I think that violence was there at the beginning. It was an unreasoning, a curious mood, and it was a cultural thing. If you read some of the literature of the late 18th century throughout Europe, but particularly in France, the pre-Romantic literature based very much on feeling, on a return to antiquity, the taste for grand actions and extreme actions and heroism and suffering.
A true revolutionary should be ready to perish in the process.
This created a mood of sort of sublimation of politics. It was, in some ways, it was a sort of mishmash with a juxtaposition of old Catholic concepts of redemption through suffering and self-sacrifice with Rousseauist ideas and themes plucked out of antiquity, which bred this idea that nothing really could be achieved without a bloodbath, without bloodletting, and ultimately without terror.
The ship of the revolution can only arrive safely at its destination on a sea that is red with torrents of blood.
Robespierre, who after all starts out as a minor literary lawyer in the provinces, they all worshipped the American Revolution, which was achieved, as they saw it, with violence. And the more they looked at the French Ancien regime, which was really almost unreformable. If Britain was constitutionally reformable in 1788 simply by reform of Parliament, France was just such a jumble of different common law and then religious laws piled up on these bizarre institutions and prescriptions of every kind governing every part of life.
Was the problem for France was that for something like 175 years, the king hadn't called any kind of parliament or legislative assembly of any kind. And so when they do that, It sort of erupts.
Yes, there's an explosion. And there's a feeling that, just fiddling with a few things here and a few things there just won't do the trick, because you have to look at the cahier de doléances, where every province was sent in their thoughts on what was wrong with the system. Well, they embrace absolutely every aspect of life. And, so where do you begin? And so in a sense, there was a feeling that, well, you just had to chuck everything on the bonfire, which on famous 4th of August, 89, the nobility did with all their titles and their decorations and supposedly their rights. let's start from scratch. Well, that was already almost a pseudo-religious rite of purification, a kind of, breastbeating act of self-abnegation. And once you get into that way of thinking and of seeing things, it is but one step to thinking that one has to purify the system. And since the law is such a mess and such a jumble, you can't do it through the law. And therefore, the rule of law, is replaced by something called justice, which is a very, very different thing, which means basically laying down a completely new law and deciding, really, according to one's own vision of things, who is right and who is wrong. As Robespierre then said, he said, there must be terror because it's only through terror that one can create civic virtue and purify the whole system.
Virtue, without which terror is destructive. Terror, without which virtue is impotent. Terror is then an emanation of virtue.
And that appealed to a lot of people. Napoleon had a lot of time for Robespierre because he too felt the whole thing was such a mess that you had to bang heads together and impose more rational forms of government and of everything else. The element of violence was there right from the beginning. And, bear in mind, the fall of the Bastille says it all. There were, I can't remember, I think it was 7 people prisoners in the Bastille, 3 of whom were completely mad. The others were in for child molestation or something, and there was one for forging money or something.
Didn't one of the prisoners think that he was Julius Caesar as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And some of them didn't want to come out. And the governor had tried to surrender, and yet they beheaded him and carried his head around on a pike. So, there was nothing rational or sensible or even, it was an absurd act and very violent and very nasty. And it not only showed that right at the beginning was there this urge for violence and for creating a tabula rasa, but also that it was utterly irrational and led by sentiment.
Rage and frenzy will pull down more in half an hour than prudence, deliberation, and foresight can build up in 100 years.
I'm so struck reading your book, Holy Madness, where you detail so much of how that Catholicism has influenced revolutionary thought. Because it seems so strange to me that no one at the time seems to think, well, hang on, we're just rebranding what's already there in some respects, in their minds at least, with the cult of the supreme being and all of that.
Yes, it's very curious. In Protestant countries where an element of rationalism had been brought into the practice of religion, it was possible to be a Voltairean or it was possible to believe in the Enlightenment and rationality and still go to church on Sundays. In Catholic countries, and it's wrong to say, as is often assumed, that the clergy was completely corrupt and so on. Yes, there were people like Talleyrand, who was a bishop and had mistresses all over the place. That happened. But the main body of the clergy were perfectly moral people. Many of them were beginning to lose their faith under the influence of the Enlightenment. But of course, as has often been said, if you stop believing in God, you start believing in something much worse, because man is conditioned to believe in something. And there were so many attempts to create an alternative, because at the rational level of how is a state to function if there's no spur to being good? The traditional spur to being good, i.e. not, stealing, robbing, murdering, and so on, was the afterlife. There'd be a final judgment and you'd roast in hell. Well, if you removed that, what was going to make people be good? And so one thing they invented was this idea of posterity. that you wanted to go down before the judgment of posterity as a virtuous, good man and an upholder of values. And so, yeah, that was very much touted by some of the philosophers, the French philosophers particularly.
Posterity is for the philosopher what the other world is for the religious.
Posterity was a pretty nebulous concept, and who was posterity, and how, and actually, did you care what posterity thought? After all, you'd be dead, and since there was no afterlife, you wouldn't even know. So why should you care? So that wasn't going to work. So you had to bring back some kind of an idea, and people had been struggling with this for a very long time. Whether it was to be some kind of supreme being, or whether it was Mother Nature, or the closest they got to something that worked, and which really survived throughout the 19th century and a good chunk of the 20th, was again a conflation of posterity with a living organism and an identifiable concept, and that was la patrie, because la patrie meant that future generations, as well as past generations, and you could accommodate into that patrie all the preceding generations. So you identified the heroes from the past who had served the patrie well, and not those who'd served it badly, in your opinion. And at the same time, la patrie was always represented as a kind of female figure, a sort of goddess that was there and that united the collective. And, if you became sainted by the patrie, people were elevated to a kind of numinous status, particularly in those paintings by David, where, Marat becomes a martyr. So do various other people. There are these paintings of heroic deaths. So you had all the trappings of Catholicism in what seemed to be a much more modern and rational form. And so everybody was re-educated to be a patriot. And that really was what kept nations together and states together in the 19th century. But of course, it had the negative side of it created nationalism, which meant that, you looked over the border to your neighbor nation and thought they were ghastly. And that in the service of your nation, it might be a good idea to go and beat them up.
That's an interesting point on nationalism, because reading again what you've written and spoken on this, there's that moment where in the early stages of the revolution where there's the admiration, where somehow the horror of decapitating the governor of the Bastille doesn't seem to register for Pitt, who believes there's going to be 15 years of peace on the back of it. And there are people from other nations that want to join in the anniversary and the celebrations, but France shuts down the gates and says, no, this is for us. What spurs that for France? Where does it become a national...
The problem is that originally France declared itself the friend of all nations, and particularly it would help enslaved nations to rise up and overthrow their tyrants and become true to themselves, and so on and so forth, which was all thoroughly praiseworthy and and tremendously internationalist.
The French nation renounces the undertaking of any war and will never use her forces against the liberty of any peoples. The French nation wishes to live with all peoples in that brotherhood ordained by nature.
And as you say, there were members of the National Assembly who were Germans, there were Poles, there were Italians. The whole idea was of a new kind of, nobody had thought it through, but the idea was very close to the idea that there would just be a huge family of nations all loving each other. And something that, people are always trying to bring about one way or another. But the problem then was the war started. And in order to mobilize troops, who are you fighting for? Before that, you said you were fighting for your king, possibly your faith. And so now you're fighting for the nation. but who are you fighting? Other nations. And this complicated things. However, if the other nations involved were happy not to fight for their tyrants, but become sister republics, then in theory they were embraced as fraternal nations. But of course, they tended to get robbed and exploited in the interests of refilling the coffers which the war had and the revolution had emptied. And then under Napoleon, they became elements on his chessboard. And indeed, he then simply collaborated with the tyrants, albeit slightly less wicked tyrants than the ones he'd toppled. So, the point about nationalism, and it's become such an accepted thing in the 20th century, particularly since the Second World War and the horrors of aggressive nationalism, that all nationalism is a frightful, destructive force. Early nationalism, i.e. the coming together of peoples around a sense of their unity of purpose and of a common past and belief in a common future, it was a very noble ideal, and arguably, if it could have been kept that way instead of being, repressed so much during the 19th century, it might not have exploded into aggressive nationalism. Mm. And indeed, what we're seeing today is a very good case in point. The tremendous sort of cult of globalization and internationalism, and isn't it nice, we're all part of one great human family, which has left some people feeling left behind, and which has also very much poo-pooed national symbols, national traditions, and all the rest of it, has in fact led to a resurgence of a much more aggressive nationalism than existed 50 years ago.
Yes, you've got the tensions of globalization, haven't you? But then there seems to be an upsurge of localism, as nations within nations.
That's true. Yeah, because people don't like having their own customs and things trashed. And one of the things that Napoleon understood, for instance, was that the revolution had profoundly upset the enormous majority of people of France who lived in the country and who remained very attached to their religion, Catholic faith, for a number of reasons, many of them having very little to do with spirituality, but having to do with custom. The revolution was extraordinarily unpopular when the convention brought in the new calendar, because before the revolution, taking into account all the main Catholic feast days and Sundays, and bearing in mind that every town had, virtually every village had a patron saint whose feast day obviously was a holiday. And since most towns had more than one patron whose feast days were holidays, and bearing in mind that one village would be a couple of miles or kilometers away from the next village, and the people intermarried, there were more feast days in the year than working days. And suddenly
sounds good.
all these bank holidays were abolished. And there was one deputy in the convention when the calendar said, which would set out the 10-day week, so 9 days of work. And one of them complained, even the draft animals can only do 6 days work a week. And it's simply unfair. So many, many reasons. And obviously these festivals were ritualistic, colourful. Usually there was a fair accompanying them, so there was fun for the whole family. But also the rituals were very rich. One saint was the patron saint of sore throats, so everybody had candles applied to their throats or whatever. One of the Virgin's feasts was to do with blessing the seeds for the next harvest. So everybody would bring seeds. Priests would go around blessing things. They'd bless the farm animals. There were loads of rituals, which are fun. People like that kind of thing. They grow attached to it. And, where the spiritual ends and simply habit begins is something very difficult to define. And that's why the revolutionaries then tried to bring in their ridiculous feasts of the Supreme Being with a tremendous amount of ritual, which seems utterly absurd to us, but they thought was a good adaptation of the kind of feast they'd abolished. And, in the villages, people were quite happy to dance around the Tree of Liberty instead of the maypole, and to kneel in front of the Tree of Liberty instead of a crucifix. But they nevertheless missed the old ones, which were imbued with a kind of sanctity, which had been the faith of their fathers and forefathers. And that holds tremendous appeal to people. Well, it did anyway.
Yes, you can't bring that from scratch to that depth, can you? In year 2 of your new calendar, you can't have that experience, that feeling that you have walking into a great cathedral. Yes. And Notre Dame was converted to the Temple of Reason. Is that correct? So, yes. How did it have religious reason services? How did that work?
They didn't have regular services. There were no sort of priests. Theoretically, there was no use for it since it was abolished, so they called it the Temple of Reason. And usually some actress or prostitute was dressed up as the goddess of reason and would sort of sit on a throne, and they would come together and sing a few hymns, many of them on the old religious tunes, but with new texts, hailing reason, and then there'd be a bit of dancing and this and that, and people joined in because why not? But they didn't really catch on. And the moment that Napoleon signed his Concordat and brought back the practice of religion, people flocked to church. Not so much in the big cities, not so much in Paris, but certainly in the provinces and in the villages, because it was something they could understand, and it gave them a sense of morality which spoke to them. Whereas all these things, lectures on civic virtue, were all a bit nebulous, and the abolition of the undermining of traditional religious practice with its underlying fear of God and fear of the final judgment, which, whatever people may say, lingers in the subconscious in most societies, meant that, particularly if you were then declaring that there was a new religion, well, you could then justify any act at all. You suddenly said, no, anybody who was born noble should be murdered because the patrie demands it. And you could argue that point. Same logic with which Hitler could argue gassing all disabled people, not to mention Jews, gypsies, gays, and so on. So, it was the violence, the unbridled violence, the enthusiastic, almost religious violence was there right from the beginning, accompanied by a sense of self-sacrifice. In 1770s, Lafayette sails to America saying, I want to bleed for freedom.
One of my favorite parts of Holy Madness actually are Lafayette sections. I think that you're very much a Dickensian historian because throughout your work, you're very, very good at exposing the ridiculous and the comic aspects of great people in history. It's right that Lafayette arrives in the New World, and the first thing he does is get stuck in a mud bank.
Yes, exactly.
He's a good character as well because self-interest comes into play there as well, doesn't it?
Yes.
Beyond the grand ideals.
Yes, which it usually does with most of us. However virtuously we believe we're doing the right thing, very often it just so happens that what we consider to be the right thing is something that suits us in some ways, if only because we want to be saved and what is the right thing. No, the point is that people forget when they're writing history that they're dealing with ordinary human beings, and however clever, brilliant, heroic somebody might be, the fact is they shit, they fart, they pick their noses, they burp, they fall over, they trip up, they spill things and break things, just like the rest of us. And it always amazes me how many historians sort of sit there with a kind of, sort of feeling as they're writing about their, the person they're writing the biography of. They may start out being very logical and very honest and all that, but there is this element of their hero becoming a hero. And I always just see the sort of comic side of things. I mean, I can see the grand side as well, how magnificent it is. But it only works if it works. And it's all too easy to just think of the past in terms of people getting on their horses and leading a charge and saber flashing in the sunlight. But the fact is, if you stop and think about it, your horse is more than likely on a battlefield. It's already strewn with cannonballs, corpses, muskets lying around, and other bits of debris and dead horses. Your charge very often isn't going to be much of a charge. It's going to be, quite a lot of sort of hobbling over stuff. And if suddenly a shell explodes too near, your horse is more than likely to shy and possibly throw you, or bump into another horse and throw another rider. And there are going to be more people hobbling around on the ground, clutching their foot that some horse has trodden on. And there's nothing particularly glorious about falling off your horse. I don't know if you have ever ridden, but I ride. And, however good a horseman you are, however good and reliable your horse, there's always the unexpected. You can always just put his hoof into a mouse hole in the ground or something, and you both go flying arse over tit. And so, the great battle scenes are not as they're represented. And I think a lot of the great oratory didn't quite work as we like to think.
Yeah.
The Abel-Gance view of history is magnificent and actually very, very important, because that's how those people saw each other or liked to see each other. But what actually happened was rather different.
Yes, luckily, most of us haven't seen a true representation of a battle, because if we had, we'd be traumatized by it. If we'd witnessed the real horror and the great man theory of history and all of that, the one date in the revolutionary calendar that I'm aware of, I can remember, is the 18th of Brumaire. Yes. Is that correct? And there's plenty of things that go quite comically wrong in that situation for Napoleon.
Absolutely. And actually nobody really knows. It's impossible to reconstruct exactly what happened. And it morphed into legend. But it was a concatenation of cock-ups. And Bonaparte very nearly ended up being guillotined with his accomplices. So one has to look at these things with a great dose of cynicism, I would say, and above all, always remember that these people are human beings. And a lot of the violence and the unpleasantness and the nastiness of the French Revolution was the fact that you had these big cities like Paris and Lyon, which were full of very poor, downtrodden, but also demoralized people who'd left their villages where some level of social control was exercised, ensured by, well, A, the practice of religion, but also by the sanction of neighbours. You don't want to be spoken of ill, and if you start stealing, they'll gang together and beat you up. So these people, if they left their villages and arrived in a great big metropolis like Paris or Lyon or one of these places, where they were just a nobody, surrounded by people desperate to exploit them, rob them, and possibly murder them, you developed a dog mentality, and you were had a pretty sour view of life in general. And then suddenly you can do anything you like in the interests of some nebulous new nonsense which some politician has brought up. You go and you rob and you loot and you shoot and you rape and it's Liberty Hall. And for these people who are demoralized, the idea that, yes, there was hunger and poverty, but The idea that it was the poverty of France and that caused the revolution, the poverty of the lower classes, is a very minor element. Yes, hunger brings people out on the streets, but it doesn't necessarily mean they want to murder or do anything else. All they want is to have a bit of bread, and they might kill for a bit of bread. But once they've got their bit of bread, they'll go home and eat it. So, hunger doesn't, that's not the main spur. And I think it's a facile view of things. Also, the French Revolution wasn't created by the poor or the downtrodden. It was created by frustrated minor noblemen and, as usual, lawyers and people who were overeducated, underemployed, and who felt undervalued. It creates every revolution and always has.
In revolutions, authority remains with the greatest scoundrels. Those who attempt to level never equalize.
Thank you for listening to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire. If you're enjoying these episodes and would like to make a small donation towards the costs of producing them, please follow the link at the bottom of the description and you can make a donation there. Every coffee you buy makes a huge difference. Thank you ever so much, and see you next time.